Take a look at this video. In a final lashing Monday, Florence triggered tornadoes all the way up to Virginia. Hurricane Florence is the latest example of how warming ocean waters caused by climate change are endangering Americans from coast to coast. As the New York Times points out, this connection has not been acknowledged by President Trump as he reverses President Obama's steps to reduce emissions from greenhouse gases. I talked to former Vice President Al Gore about all this as the Carolinas continue to deal with historic floods. Mr. Vice President, we're in the midst of a hurricane, the aftermath of hurricanes, all of the storms, storm surge based on rising sea levels. These storms are stronger than what we've experienced in the past. What do you say to the climate change deniers, led by the President of the United States?
Well, I think at this point it matters less what I would say to them, or even more importantly, what the scientists would say to them, than what Mother Nature is saying to them. Not only do we have this massive storm hitting the U.S., but simultaneously the Philippines is being slammed by another super typhoon, Mangkhut. Hawaii is being hit by Tropical Storm Olivia. We just finished the largest fire in the history of California a month ago. Every night on the television news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelation.
Presidential leadership in moments of crisis is very, very important, as you know better than anyone, having been in the White House. What does it say to America when, in the aftermath of a storm a year ago in Puerto Rico and in the United States, the President of the United States denies a scientific death count?
From his own administration.
And says that there were not 3,000 people, nearly 3,000 people dead.
Yeah, well, thank you for asking the question. Honestly, for me, when a new outrage comes along every few hours, I have to download some existing outrage to make room for the new outrage. And this is one that stands out, just as he criticized his own Justice Department for proceeding to prosecute corruption at the risk of losing some Republican seats in Congress. These are not normal actions or statements by a president. We all know that. But I have the sense, Andrea, that there are a large number of Americans who don't want to get into the arguments about Donald Trump, but they are quietly very determined to go to the polls this November. Because if there was ever a time to activate the checks and balances our founders put into the Constitution, now is that time.
We in the media, political figures, people in the Democratic Party discounted the anxiety of a lot of Americans in so-called red states. People who were against NAFTA, against trade agreements.
Yes.
How do you counteract that? How do you know that won't happen again in 2018 and 2020?
Well, of course it could. You're quite right that the stagnation of middle-income wages for more than 40 years has been largely responsible for this wave of populist authoritarianism that is now present not only in the United States, but in quite a few other countries around the world. I'm a member of the Democratic Party, and I will say both parties have to respond much more effectively to the deep concerns and anxieties that Americans have been expressing, and they have not gotten the kind of response that's needed.
You spoke of norms being changed, and when we have the president criticizing the Justice Department for not being partisan enough, how do you counteract that? Well,
the rule of law is the bedrock of the United States of America. And going back to the Magna Carta, long before our revolution and our founding, we cannot allow that to be challenged or overturned. And this experiment with Trumpism is not going well in the view of most people. And, you know, in science and medicine, some experiments are terminated early for ethical reasons. But to answer your question, I think that there is more resilience in the American system than we often give it credit for. We have gone through worse times. We have bounced back before. We have seen, for example, in the wake of Watergate, the reestablishment of norms of ethics and behavior that restored our equilibrium as a country. And in the wake of Donald Trump, whenever that comes, I think we have an excellent chance to see the reestablishment of what the real spirit of America ought to be. I know there's polarization and disagreement in the country, but I also think that there is a growing number among Donald Trump's base of support who are really quite worried, now beginning to get worried, and they also think maybe checks and balances are what we need right now. So these elections this November may turn out to be the beginning of a course correction.
I want to ask you about a White House under siege by an outside investigation. You saw what that was like for a president of the United States. Do you have any sympathy for the argument that a president should not have to submit to an investigation while he or she is still trying to run the country?
None whatsoever. I understand the point, but no person is above the law. Full stop.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.